Israelis could probably.
What about H3? You guys
They have.
you know anything about
Okay, I think we're good to go. What you're seeing actually is shot in Palestine, and it's old Jordanian barracks. When they left them there. The Israeli military also uses them for practice. So I wanted to, it's part of a larger film I did on shooting the blur, looking at leftover state structures or hidden state structures in Palestine and Israel, including obviously Palestinian structures that are, what you see the remains of are simply olive trees. This which is interesting how the structures, you see a lot of British structures left, so we kind of shot them all, and the blur is to blur all the different state structures. But this basically is remains of a Jordanian military structure that then is used by Israelis for like practice, and people squat there, so that's also kind of, I thought it would work well, particularly for the second part of the Zizek lecture, which we'll do next week, but I'll give you a different visual image for next week. But I thought it would work well for the Zizek. And you may notice that, if you didn't notice, I'll tell you anyway, I haven't put the bullet points in yet. The main ones are basically subjective, objective, and symbolic violence. The reason I haven't done that is because I've been like super busy, but I will do that. We're doing hires we're hiring another political theorist, right? Which is awesome, and we're doing interviews every day, and I'm filming all the interviews, so we're interviewing all this week. And I just didn't have a chance. I'm also, I edited one diss on break, and I got 10 pages to go on editing another dissertation. So I had to do something else last night. Having said that, it wasn't a matter of just, clicking C. I was going to write the bullet points, but then I didn't have my computer at home. I had other computers. I'd left it here. So how's that for an excuse? Does that work? I was like, yes. I had 2 other computers there, but I was like, no, my lecture's on this one. So the reason Zizek's on here is because in a way he brings, it's an awesome book. He brings together a number of the theorists, not just the theorists on violence, but he also obviously uses Hegel. He uses some Nietzsche. Just checking the filming. He uses some Nietzsche. He uses Kant. Then you're going to see him directly using Benjamin. He directly is influenced by Fanon. Derrida's work on violence is also in there, and you're also going to see what we're going to do next, the work on technology sort of foregrounded, and he makes a reference to Heidegger there as well. He writes the book like an opera, so he has them set, the sections are set apart in terms of terms that are used, and I'm not going to lecture on that because I don't know them well enough to lecture on that, but I want you to be aware that he does that. Zizek has a really good book on Wagner, and he also writes an opera. So he's organized the book in the way that an opera would be organized when you go to hear it, which I thought was kind of interesting as an approach. For those people that have read Zizek before, you'll find that he kind of repeats some of the similar jokes. So his Lenin joke about and I'll tell it or I'll reference it, he tends to repeat similar jokes in all of his books. So Slavoj Zizek, obviously, I don't know if anybody who doesn't know who he is. Slavoj Zizek is a social political theorist who's been very influential in redefining how we do theory for a significant period of time. Zizek, of course, is still alive. He periodically gets into trouble for various things, theoretical things and personal things, right? I've heard him speak, as I'm sure some people here, if you've been around the last 2 or 3 years, I've heard him speak a number of times. His early work on Lacan is amazing, for example, and he's very influenced by Lacan. That's the other one that's going to come out here. His large book on Hegel, and I'm not going to claim that I've read it all, but it's also on the phenomenology of spirit, is also quite amazing. He's an amazing theorist. He's also what you would consider a public intellectual, and he's very personable. If he's speaking, he takes questions, he will talk to people. He also will make contentious and sometimes wrong's the wrong word, but He'll make contentious and claims that people don't agree with, or so he will make political claims. And that's, is there anything for people that know Zizek I can add to that? The other thing he's really interested in is what he starts off with there is the post-political. And he defines the post-political in a very interesting way. So he's extending Benjamin, he's extending Fanon, he is drawing on Lacan, he's drawing on Hegel, he's also drawing on Heidegger, he's drawing on people I probably haven't mentioned but will come out when Foucault, biopolitics is using Foucault. What he's really looking at, he's saying, look, and we can talk about this because maybe it's not the case. I don't know. I've always had trouble with the post-political. But what he means by post-political is, he says, today we're in the middle of a politics, a mode of politics, which he identifies as post-political. And by that he means it's a he gives you the definition on page 40, and by that he means it's a politics of administration and expert management. It's basically a politics about the administration of life, and he calls it a post-political biopolitics. And of course, the biopolitics is the administration of people's bodies, the management of the expert management and administration in terms of security and welfare of human lives. So, you can fit a lot into that. For example, people, you can definitely argue that in a post-political world, that it's a post-political biopolitics, which you can get is an American nation state under the current administration being worried about immigrants and enforcing a biopolitics, particular immigrants, biopolitics on their bodies in terms of expelling the bodies and putting their bodies in danger. Under the name of protecting the citizen bodies. That's all a biopolitics. Now, post-political doesn't mean there isn't the word political used. It basically means we've entered a type of politics which is about the administration and management of both economics and human bodies. What Zizek says is that this produces extreme violence, obviously. So in the intro, he talks about how he's organized this, and he sets out in what he calls, in the section he calls the tyrant's bloody road, in terms of administered politics. He's providing what he calls 6 sideway reflections. And in these 6 sideways reflections, we're going to do the first 3 today. He's using the structure of how an opera is written to present them. He's going to look at the type of violence that occurs in a post-political world. He's very careful to point out that it's not that he agrees with post-political, he just sees the world being post-political. And in post-political, one of the things that happens is that ideology disappears. Only it doesn't really disappear as we know, right? Ideological struggles are left behind. Now you can say, well, no, look, under Trump America, ideological struggles are not left behind. That you've got a highly administrative type of politics and management, and the administration and management of biopolitics of people's bodies, and you've also got a very strong political ideological response. So I think I haven't read Zizek's writing on Trump America yet. He's written something. He's going to have to argue that, there's been a move away from the post-political, while holding key features of the post-political, which is holding the politics of administration, holding this idea of expert management, and also holding the biopolitics applied to certain bodies, that is, illegal immigrant bodies, in the violence of removing them in the name of safety. And if you listen to his address to Congress, in the name of keeping the bodies safe. So what you've got there very quickly is also, what somebody like Schmidt talks about in terms of the friend-enemy. That's being, and Zizek does draw on friend-enemy there. That's being employed and deployed. So in post-politics, the focus is on expert management and administration of the population. That, you have that. But you've also got a return, I think, to political, ideological response to that. So you've got both. Now, biopolitics is Foucault's term. And on page 40, just so you got the working definition of biopolitics that Zizek's using, and if you've read any Foucault, you'll probably have a similar one. If you take a look on page 40 where he's defining post-politics, he's also defining biopolitics as the regulation of the security and welfare of human lives. This is Foucault's term, biopolitics. Zizek says, once one has renounced big ideological causes, what remains is the efficient administration of life. And you could probably going, right. And isn't that partly, if you've read Eichmann in Jerusalem, if you've read Hannah Arendt's book on Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is Eichmann's trial, Eichmann, of course, being one of the administrators in the Nazi regime, talks about the administration of life. Like, that's what it's about. All he was doing was administrating life. So the post-political, what's seen as being post-political and grounded in administration, doesn't mean that it's not informed by a political understanding of the world. What it means is that political deliberation is not playing a part in it. So it's the efficient administration of life. So big ideological causes get reduced to the efficient administration of life. Now, Zizek sees this as having even more violence than when you've got something like the way Schmidt understands the political. And Zizek sees this as having a silent violence. So remember to go back to Schmidt. Schmidt understands the politics as that which, usually the state, who can say these are our enemies, that can set out the enemy, that is in control of people's lives and saying that you must fight against our enemy and declaring this the enemy. Zizek sees post-political as even having more violence than that. He says part of the problem in the post-political world is that what's taken to be violence, that is what we recognize as violence, is only the most visible form. It's the most visible, obvious signs of violence. So by these, he means crime, terror, unrest, civil unrest, international conflict. What's not so obvious is what he calls normal violence. Normal violence, and his terms are interesting because he doesn't use them the way one would even think they would use them. Normal violence is what he considers the objective violence of the regime. So, if you go back to Benjamin, what would be included in the objective violence of the regime would be obviously founding, maintaining violence. It would be mythical violence. That's all there as part of normal violence. It would be the police that are working in terms of maintaining the regime. It would be what you can and cannot do. That is what Zizek calls objective violence that exists in a peaceful, normal state of affairs, that we don't even see it. It's normal, objective violence that structures a peaceful state of things. You got your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's systemic violence. For reproduction.
Yes, it's systemic violence, but he's going to combine with systemic violence. That's good, actually. He's going to combine with systemic violence also symbolic violence, because he's influenced by Lacan. But yes, so you can see then this, and I'm going to talk about systemic violence in a couple of minutes, so thanks. But you can see then that the objective violence is systemic violence that comes from what you don't see, and also from the symbolic rule of law.
So,
Yes, that's it.
so Trump's wall?
Well, Trump's wall is really interesting because that's going to be what
That's,
Zizek would call, yes, that would be,
that's dividing people into
but I think it's, because, where Zizek gets interesting is what he calls subjective violence. Subjective violence is the violence we can actually see. So we're going to be, for sure, be able to see that wall. Okay? But it also arises from what Jordan has named as systemic violence of the regime. And it arises from the idea of the post-political administration, all done with a political project. And it arises from the very much objective violence of the regime.
because it's really defining the other, right? That wall.
Yes, and it's also symbolic because
Yeah.
it relates to all three of them. It's a good example. And defining the other, yeah. Excuse me, yeah, that's great. So then, this objective violence in the normal peaceful state of things that sustains the system is precisely what Jordan just said. It is the systemic violence at the heart of the post-political world. It's the violence that keeps everything functioning smooth, economically and politically. Objective violence is the normal peaceful state of things that sustains our effort to fight violence, and that's where it's interesting because it sustains our efforts to fight what he calls subjective violence, that is violence you can see, and to promote tolerance, and this type of violence is the systemic violence of the regime. And it's this type of violence that he calls objective and systemic that really makes it run smoothly. When it's not running smoothly, for example, when you've got like massive protests, then objective violence in the post-political breaks apart. There's a rupture in it. So when you see mass protests, or when you see the Million Women's March, when you see the General Strike Day, when you see March 8th as a general call for general strike, that's a rupture of objective violence. Now, that could be seen as a subjective violence because you can see it. So for something like Sorel, he's also quite influenced by Sorel, and I forgot to mention that. So something like Sorel's proletarian general strike would be seen as subjective violence against the regime because you can see it, and because it's coming from a particular point of view. Something that what Sorel calls force, that is force and not violence, violence being the violence of the people, the violence that the state doesn't engage in, that force then is part of the objective systemic violence. So we can actually plug into this. Where it gets tricky is what I would think of as subjective violence is what he calls objective violence. And he's doing it for a purpose. He's saying, subjective violence you can see, all right? Subjective violence could be the response violence against a post-political administered society, or it could be the violence of police rounding up certain citizens or non-citizens and imposing the law on them, whereas they're not imposing the law on other people. They're not checking other people. The subway example is always a good example, right? Because you can really see right in front of you, when people are checking there, whether you've got your pass or whatever, you can see who's targeted, and you're never sure whether the people doing it are conscious or unconscious. It's so weird. But that's subjective. You can see that. What's motivating it is objective violence. So Zizek wants to say the most harmful type of violence, obviously, is the systemic force of the state that you can't see, which he's calling objective. It's just there. Yes, that is.
So what would he call carding?
What would he call it?
Like carding certain individuals?
That also is a very good question. So basically, that's going to be objective because it comes from the post-political, but as it manifests, you can see it manifesting, so you could say, well, that's subjective because certain people are going to be carded and certain people aren't. Right? So the way that's imposed is a subjective imposition. I think that's where I'd go with that. But for sure it's objective and systemic because the policy has been passed. But you can see it operating, so then it's going to be subjective. That's a very good question. Objective violence, it's on page 2, I think. Objective violence is invisible. Yes, page 2. Objective violence is invisible because it sustains, or since it sustains what he calls the very zero-level standard against which we perceive something as being subjectively violent. Middle of the page. Objective violence is invisible since it sustains the very zero-level standard against which we perceive something as subjectively violent. So the carding is an absolutely excellent example because we can perceive that as subjectively violent. But the reason it's formed is because of objective violence. Now if you go to the top of the page, it's where he talks about systemic violence. And he says, there's what I call systemic violence, and this is objective violence. Subjective violence is the invisible form of violence. What you don't, subjective violence, let me back up, is the visible form of violence. Objective violence, it's just a continuation of that quote. Objective violence is invisible. Subjective violence, when you see it manifest, is the visible form. Now, symbolic violence, so you've got, is everybody clear on that? What the difference between, okay, so systemic violence is the objective violence of the regime. It's also the symbolic, and I'm going to talk about the symbolic. The subjective violence is going to be visible.
Could you give like maybe one example of each?
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, Radhika's example is great. Okay, so Radhika's example is, okay, you see somebody being carded. Okay, that's subjective violence. Okay, you can see it happening. But what's motivating that happening is objective violence. It's the systemic violence of the regime. The symbolic, of course, to go back to Lacan from first term, is basically the rule of law. So it's the rule of law. It's going to be there in speech, language, discourse. He says symbolic violence is embedded and embodied in language. So so the language that would go with that, Luca, the language that would go with that would be, the right of citizens to have non-citizens or suspect people carded. That's what would go. So there's a symbolic language that's going to support the objective violence that you see being manifest in terms of visible violence. Are those examples work?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
Right,
I think
the
that,
TTC officer that target a young kid.
and poor people, people who seem to be traveling with, what they always target is people who are traveling with, it looks like their belongings.
So sad.
I know, so that really, that just also, or carding, you were thinking of carding in terms of carding in the American system where they say, do you have your green card? Like, which you have to carry with you at all times. And a friend of mine lost his green card and was like really, really worried because of course he gets targeted, and when he gets targeted it also becomes really upsetting for him because on one of his documents he's listed as female because he was female, and he also looks Muslim and Orthodox Jewish at the same time because it's a particular look he's doing. So he's doing it for, he's an artist. He's doing it for a political reason, and it's okay when he has his card, but he lost it for a long time. And so then he was really subjected to getting kicked out when he got carded. And he's also, if you take a bus into the US, again, you can see, first of all, they really target buses more than airplanes because poor people travel on buses, right? And when they do that, they target certain people that has to do with race, age, class. I mean, basically all the signifiers of objective violence, which is what leads to the carding and the targeting. You know, and it's really I mean, Luca probably summed it up better. It's just really sad because you can see it happening, and borders are one of the places you can really see the objective violence of a regime subjectively manifesting. So you can see it. Yeah.
I'm still having trouble with what objective violence is.
I know, because that's the hard one. It's because you can't see it. Okay, it's objective violence is, and maybe Jordan got it because that's when he said it's simply the systemic violence of the regime you don't see.
Oh.
Like that's it. It's there, and just combine that also with the idea of a symbolic. It's there. So the systemic violence is there in terms of objective and symbolic. Symbolic, of course, Zizek's understanding the same way as Lacan, by meaning that it's embedded in language. So we have violence itself embedded in our language that we just take as speaking. I probably just, you know, in my speech, in my words, probably just did a form of subjective violence without even knowing it because I was born and grew up and were formed in language. So I was formed in a language that Zizek and Lacan would say has embedded in it violence. And that violence that's embedded in it becomes part of the systemic violence of the regime. And it's objective in that you can't see it. And I understand your problem with that because I had a terrible time trying to figure out why you would call it objective violence. You know? And subjective violence, is that what you don't, is that what you do see? You know, so, you know how it is, like, you see, I sometimes still get stopped because of my hair. So I often get checked crossing borders because I fit a profile, and especially if I'm alone, I fit a profile which is kind of interesting because what they do is pat down my hair. You know, but you know that's kind of amusing for me. But it's certainly not amusing if you actually are subjected to the objective violence manifest on your body when you cross a border and you're taken as being suspicious, and you may or may not have the right documentation, and the documentation keeps changing. Right? So you know that gets really scary. So as you know, and it's not at all compared to like, you know, them just checking me because I could be carrying drugs in my hair or something, right? That's nothing. And especially if you have if you're a prof and you have a passport and they ask you what you do and all that, like, you know, but if you cross the border, for example, and you say, oh, you know, they ask you your profession, and you say, oh, well, you know, I'm a photographer. Okay, well, photographer is one of those words they check because you could also be a sex worker, and they like to hassle sex workers at borders. You could be a radical, and when they run you through the computer, if anything comes up, like then you're subject to subjective violence. But what's motivating all of that is the objective violence of the system, which says we have to check certain people because they could be bringing stuff into our country or they could be dangerous. Then you profile the people. And believe me, in the profiling of the people, that is done according to an objective violence and a symbolic language system that the people doing it are not even aware if there's violence embedded in them until it's subjectively manifest. If you want to give them benefit of the doubt. If they're aware and they're doing it, then, I don't know, then you have to ask yourself, okay, I know people need jobs. And I know, okay, they have to check certain things, but there are ways of going about doing it. Right? Okay, people have their hands up, and I don't know who was first, but let's go. Hold on. I see we have a break. I'm blanking on people's names. Jasmine, okay.
Could we look at this division of violence from a Marxist approach?
Absolutely, because Zizek is a Marxist, right? Good.
Like today, if you look at the denial of unemployment insurance for so many people, I see that as systemic violence, and then the symbolic violence behind it would be, you know, like capitalist or neoliberal rhetoric.
Yes, nice.
Like the subjective manifestation of that would be people homeless or forced into exploited work positions.
That's a brilliant example. Did everybody hear that? Because it works really well. And Zizek, I forgot to say, is quite influenced by Marx, and would consider himself a Marxist. So that's great. Okay, Jordan, you had your hand up, but somebody else did. Ian did, and was there anybody else?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's your first name?
Arwen.
Arwen. Okay, you're presenting today, aren't you? Yes. And you presented last week or something when you were 6. You got 2 of them. Did you present last time?
Yeah.
Okay. How come you're presenting twice? But that's awesome. I don't even want to know. I'll just write the grade down and be good. Arwen, and then Jordan, and then Ian.
Yeah, I was just gonna. Oh wait,
It's
Arwen first?
Arwen,
Yeah,
Jordan,
sorry.
Ian.
You pointed to me first, and then I was
No,
like,
I was
okay.
pointing over there.
Sorry, I was
So like,
jumping
I'm
again.
sorry.
It's okay. Don't worry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I'm just trying to figure this out. So like an example for like if we think about back to Nixon when he was like, okay, let's do like we need a war on drugs and all of this, right? So would that be like the objective violence, and then in terms of like subjective violence, you see like disproportionate arrests of like people of color?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's really good. And to go back to what Yasmin said too, and then you've got the language that allows you to do that. You develop a symbolic language that says, you know, you can always tell you've got a symbolic language when it claims that something's a threat. Okay? But there's a threat, it's a threat of harm, that kind of stuff. That's going to allow you then to implement subjective violence. That's good. Jordan.
I was just going to say, I think it's perfect from a Marxist perspective because he always makes the dichotomy between objective and subjective. And for objective, it's a highly abstract category where there's, in this particular instance, systemically, it would be a coercive law that not necessarily is arbitrarily put upon or enforced or in a particular situation because every single law has to be carried out in the actual action itself.
That would also go into symbolic, because if they're in written law. The objective is stuff we don't see.
Yeah, so my example would be, from a Marxist perspective, would be most people don't see that you are coerced into a wage labor relation. So, you know, right there, nobody's coming around and saying, you have to get a job or else you're going to jail.
Your parents
But
kind
you're
of, going to jail.
coerced systemically because you won't be able to provide the means of subsistence. So he gives the commodity fetishism and the whole inverse, you know, where we're being alienated from ourselves and a system is controlling us. That's how he shows it. So that's a perfect example of how, you know, you're not being coerced. No police is coming up to you and saying, like, get a job now or else we're going to throw you in jail, but you're going to have to for your own survival, for your own sake.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Yep, good example. Yeah, Ian.
There's an element of violence, so when you cross the border, like now computers are using algorithms to determine threats, and they're not, it's no longer even, it's subjective at the start because they're defined threats, but the computers are rewriting their own programs to be more efficient to identify threats based upon patterns.
Yes.
So violence is actually escaped beyond, it's escaped into the realm of technology.
Absolutely, that's great actually, because yes, and our assumptions, it became covert assumptions and symbolic, are fed into and then become algorithms, which whereas it takes on the technological aspect, it's completely objective, it's hidden. And it manifests, when you see it manifesting, you're like, it's manifesting in a similar pattern to the way it always has.
And it's lost, it has the ability to supervise itself.
That's
I mean,
interesting.
because it definitely, the programs are written to identify patterns and then adjust for them as they see it. So the computers see things and then change accordingly without human intervention. And as artificial intelligence grows, that level of violence will be beyond human supervision.
Yeah, that is actually a great observation because, because one can argue that sadly, in artificial intelligence, as it has initially been human constructed, are the biases that we have in our language itself.
But so if you're writing a sentient, well, so if your goal is for cognitive abilities in technology, they will have the ability to then make assumptions of their own independent from human subjectivity, and so they've created a different level of objectivity.
But then I'm all fine with that, that's great. But then you have to ask yourself, when it's manifest at the visible level, why does it seem to be the same old subjects that are targeted and some new ones?
Because I think it mimics our behavior. like our behavior, so it's identifying our behavior. So I think the argument would be that at some point, artificial intelligence becomes fully sentient and makes decisions based upon its own value system.
That's fine. I'm all with that on artificial intelligence, but it has to start. It starts off from somewhere, and so our behavior, it's not going to be enough because myself and somebody else can behave the very same way in a lineup, and they'll get pulled over.
Right, but so at some point that computer's going to make a decision based upon maybe your behavior isn't the threat that it's been identified by its original program,
Right.
and it's
Okay.
decided to say, no, we don't care whether your hair is different or whatever.
Absolutely.
That doesn't identify you as a threat, but the fact that you've crossed the border 16 times and you're self-employed, to like the computer decides that's
Yes.
the defining.
Okay, I see where you're going with that. Yeah, that works fine. That works fine. Yes, and tell me your name.
Peter.
Peter. Got it.
I was gonna say about, I don't know much about like the specific algorithms or whatever he's talking about, but if you have a system where humans are in charge of it in the beginning, and let's say they're, I don't know, targeting brown people disproportionately, well, they're gonna
Yes, they
find people who happen to be brown and happen to be committing some sort of act of violence, and then they're gonna feed that information into the computer when they go to make the transition. So the computer is gonna keep working off of that information. So
Nicely
it's that,
said. And add to it.
yeah,
And
so
all
it's the initial statistical bias is carried through by computers, not cured by it. Well,
That's it. I would agree with that, Peter. That's not, and it's also very nicely said. And here's the other thing that gets really weird. We all know it. Okay, we all know that part of what we could call systemic objective violence and part of the symbolic realm that are embedded in there and embodied in language and in the objective, we all know that there's racism, there's sexism, there's homophobia. It's all embedded in there. It's been embedded. It comes right out of the liberal project. We know that. When we see subjective violence, we see it being repeated. So it's, again, it's when Zizek talks about fetish disavowal, which is a great term. Okay, so fetish disavowal. We don't actually do this because we all know it. The fetish disavowal, which I'll get to, is when you know something and you see it, but you go, I know it, I see it, it's not happening. Which is very interesting. It's like a cognitive dissonance that happens, right? And you go, you know, and the example it comes out of, where it comes out of the Freud example, where the little, and this is like, okay, I did a lot of work with this example, I really flipped it. I'm not going to flip it for you, I'll just give you the original example. So the original example for Freud is, and Zizek is playing with fetish disavowal on this, is that this little boy looks up his mother's skirt and he freaks out. He's like three I think. Freaks out because there's no penis. Okay, and then he has to have fetish disavowal. He didn't see it. He knows it's not there, but he's going to forget it, right? So it's the whole idea, and he's got a good definition of fetish disavowal. I probably should wait until I get. Oh, here it is. His definition of fetish disavowal is on page 53. And he says, basically, I know, but I don't want to know that I know, so I don't know. It's brilliant, actually. It's a brilliant way to get around things. It's like, I know, and I lost it. Okay, so I want to say that again, because that is fetish disavowal, and we do it all the time. I know, but I don't want to know that I know, so I don't know. I know it, but refuse to fully assume the consequences of this knowledge so that I can continue to act as if I don't know. We probably do that with objective violence in a way, I think. Yeah, Ian.
So I think like Trump's speech last night is a perfect example of that. Like he acted normal for an hour, and that.
They hired somebody, I swear.
But that allows people to disavow that crazy past
Brilliant.
that you don't want to believe, but you know it's true. Like you have 2 years or 70 years of behavior, but 1 hour of acting normal is supposed to make it okay. That's fetish disavowal.
It's so true.
That's a brilliant
Yeah.
example. You get Van Jones saying, you know, of course there's lots of problems, but he really behaved like a president.
Yeah.
But it doesn't
Very
matter.
legitimate.
It doesn't change the. I mean,
Absolutely.
that's projecting something onto the screen that you want to see. That's Lacanian.
Yeah,
That's a stain on a screen.
Yes, that's great. It's And that's a great example of fetish disavowal.
Or putting your
I'll-
head in the sand, that's another one,
They're
right?
putting
We
their
always
head in
say
the
it.
sand.
Well, that's,
And it's
that's what
simple.
it is. It's like you live with what you can't live with by living with it.
Yeah, and yes, okay, that's good, that's really good. So at the symbolic, the idea that violence is embedded in a body and language, what Zizek's drawing on here is Heidegger and Lacan, but he's drawing on Heidegger's idea, because he mentions Heidegger there, whereas, we dwell in language. It's our house of being. Heidegger was, Lacan picked this up also from Heidegger, but there's other people, like, it kind of comes from Hegel too in a sense, but the language is our house of being, our dwelling, and Zizek says, and our dwelling is a violent dwelling. That social domination is reproduced in our speech forms. So when you read the history of Western political thought, or modern political thought, what you're going to see in there, and we can do this with Nietzsche when we get to the Nietzsche part of this lecture, but what you do with Zizek too. But what you're going to see there is the language you're reading really is a violent dwelling. That the social domination of the time is often reproduced in the text, and then you have to see what is reproduced and what isn't. Then he says, we, and by we he's defining we, the post-industrial rich, the virtual class. We live in this false sense of urgency. We have to think fast. And what he wants with this is we live in a false sense of urgency where there's no time to reflect. Now, if any of you have ever watched any Zizek tapes or seen Zizek, Zizek is really, really, really speedy. He has an intense false sense of urgency. What's really interesting about Zizek is his body can't really contain his ideas. Which, it'd be nice to be able to think that fast.
Usually it's kind of like going like this all the time.
There's probably other, yes,
He's
and
grabbing
maybe,
his nose and
there may be other reasons for that part of it, but
That's true, that's true. Maybe that's why that's why he speaks.
But you have seen people, you all, that their body can't contain the speed of their ideas. And one of the problems with that is that you don't have any time to reflect. And then you've seen somebody like Obama is a great example of someone who has time in his speech patterns to reflect. Even if he's not reflecting, there's time in the speech patterns to reflect. Now, here again, Zizek's using Heidegger, and he's using Heidegger to say that it's, now, Heidegger's a really good example. You read Being in Time, and I'm doing a reading course with a grad student in Being in Time again. I've read it 4 times. He doesn't have 5th time. And I have to say I can never really I get parts of Being in Time, which is what you'll get. But it's very interesting when you start reading it. So you read it for the concepts, but you can also read it for the violence embedded in the text, right? Even though, I try to cut any reader I'm reading as much slack as I can in terms of like trying to get what's good out of their text, and then to see what is the violence in the text. But I was thinking it'd be really interesting to have a course on simply identifying the violence in key, like the violence that is embedded in key texts, that as a reader, so, I was talking about this on the job interviews. One of the things you notice when you're lecturing, right, is that certain texts, one of the texts is Hegel's Master Slave. Certain texts, when people are reading it, another one is Nietzsche, for example, Das Buch Zarathustra. It produces rage in the reader. Okay, it produces rage in the reader, and you can see that the rage at the text actually has an affect. So when you're lecturing, you can actually see the rage that the text is producing sometimes, which is very interesting because, believe me, there was a time when I started off reading Heidegger, I could not read anything of his without pausing about every 5 minutes and saying, Heidegger, who is a Nazi, and then going on, which took a lot longer to read stuff. But it was my only, although it's sort of performative, but it was my only way of being able to read that without feeling that I was being snowed, right? Because, as a reader, you don't want to be snowed. So for example, and I hope you don't mind that I use your example, January, but for example, it's January, right? Yeah, okay. For example, when you read a text and you see stuff like when he's talking about today, Nietzsche's going to be talking about the dwarf. And he's going to be talking about the dwarf as this part-like animal. Okay, and you kind of go, damn, I know this is part of the canon, but it's actually making me kind of nauseous, right? And then there's a rage that builds up in terms of what he says. Now that is, and I think you were quite amazingly right to point that out, that is a violence that is embodied in the language of the text. Now Nietzsche, in a sense, is interesting because you can visibly see it, okay? You can subjectively see it if you want to use these categories. Other thinkers, and I'll say Heidegger's one of these, it's totally objectively there, but you can't see it as so visibly. So in a sense then, what he's saying about symbolic violence being embedded in language, and when you look at the canon of different disciplines, it's right there. And unless it's pointed out, now you can't just always draw on or dwell on the violence, but unless it's pointed out, then people end up taking it as, what would you say? Taking it as like a neutral text, or taking it, not seeing the objective violence that's there. So just taking it as a text, and not seeing really what's going on and how it reflects the time period it's written in, all that kind of stuff. It's just there and taken as given. Meanwhile, you're reading it, and you're getting agitated, mad, and, acting up, or swearing at the text, which some of my husbands used to do at points, right? Or throwing it around, there's always that, or announcing the person's a fascist while they're reading it. Yes, Yasmin.
Could the exclusion of certain people from discourses also count as violence?
Absolutely. Okay, totally. Really good point. The exclusion of certain people. That would be women, that would be race, that would be ethnicity, depending on which text you read. Yes, absolutely. That's extreme violence. So if you read Locke's Social Contract, there you got it. Now that doesn't mean you don't understand the social contract and see how it can be used, but it definitely means you say, okay, in that particular example of Locke, you can see the subjective violence there. It's visible, like what is missing. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I personally think that's the highest form of objective violence in any literature, is that it's always focusing on specific groups. There's never cosmopolitan works. If you look, it's very rare to come across one where they're making a political or economic critique and they take into consideration humanity and the world. They always focus on this culture, their culture. What I mean? They can't take into consideration on a cosmopolitan scale a lot of the time. I know there are people, we went over Kant's cosmopolitan intent, but still you can see the violence in there because...
You can even go further than that. You can see the violence that's incorporated into the term they call humanity.
Yeah.
Which you see with Schmidt, for example. And we saw that with another author too, that the humanity itself has this embedded violence in it. So all you have to say is, who is outside the law? Who's excluded? Who's not included in, for example, Locke's social contract? Who's not included in Hobbes? And it's basically what's included is a property of people at the time. So yes, that's very much it's visible once you start taking it apart. But the other thing you really notice is, York is interesting because you're really trained to critically see that. In a way, people that have been PhDs in other schools, some of them don't really see that. They kind of spin around without actually identifying the subjective violence there. I think it's really important. I think it's really important to to be able to reflect and see what it is that what the text has in terms of objective violence. Can you see that in terms of what's visible and the very language of it? So when you're reading the text, to go back, I think Jenny Ray pointed this out earlier too. When you go back and you see the text always says man when it means person. Okay, we know, you do fancy footwork when you're lecturing, you say he, she, you say human, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the text that people are reading says man. And I think, again, and it has, sometimes it's taken to be humanity, and for Fanon it is. And it was Fanon who has a great critique of humanity. And other times it's meant to be taken exactly as man. That's it. So in that sense, I think the objective violence and the symbolic that Zizek's talking about, he would say is the most frightening and deadly because we're not trained to notice it. We only notice it, to go to Radhika's example, when it spills into something that's subjective and visible, and somebody's asked for the card and they don't have their card. Or just in the asking for their card, and just in the asking for it, that's subjective, visible violence. Right? Okay. So we got this false sense of urgency. So we don't really have time to reflect. And Zizek's picking up on Heidegger's claim that it's the human ability. Now this is so weird, because this is Heidegger's claim, it's this great claim. And I'll probably cover it in his lecture on technology, because I think that's where it is. It's like, his claim is that it's the human ability to reflect. That's reflective thinking, what it means to think, to reflect, that can save us from becoming technology's standing reserve army. And you're thinking, okay, so, and I think this every time I read that. Okay, this critical ability to reflect, which is great, and he tells you how to do it, did not save you from joining the Nazi Party. And you're kind of like, how is that possible? Well, I think it's possible because you're just taken as given. I only thought this at the moment, because I'm always trying to figure that out. I'm like, well, how is that even possible? And what does it mean to this concept of being? Because it's embedded in the same language. But I think it's possible because you're not aware of the objective violence and the symbolic violence of what you're thinking. And if you take Lacan's argument that Zizek is taking, which is that we're born into language, we actually come, so there's no inherent self for Lacan, obviously, right? There's no total subject. We're born into language, and you come to think in language, and if you come to think in a language which has embedded violence in it, you're going to think that way. And that's probably the answer for that. Yeah, Jordan.
Isn't that kind of presupposing that when you reflect on something that is rational, it doesn't have to necessarily be rational to have the ability to reflect on these things? I mean, he could potentially not have, or I don't know, somehow rationalize the whole idea of the rise of Nazi Germany.
So you're saying I'm basically cutting him too much slack?
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah.
Yes, I think you're right.
You can't just say, like, it's
I have heard
from
that
a
comment
structure,
before.
Yeah, like a structural functionalist, it gives no room for agency, right? You're just saying he's determined by his time, and this was a time.
No, I'm not saying that about Heidegger. I'm saying anybody who puts a key part of their theory, that you have to be able to slow down and critically reflect.
Yeah.
And then just does it in terms of like a post-political and goes into an administrated society, is guilty of the very thing his theory is telling people that they should do. Is guilty of not doing the very thing that his theory is telling them they should do.
Oh, okay, so that's for contemporary, though. Like, we're in this, we reflect, but we don't reflect? We have an urgency? No.
Yeah, that's that. Okay, I'm
I'm
gonna go back on
confused.
this, but I want you to get this right. And, okay, and clearly I'm not, my speech is not getting it right. But I'm very animated about it, right? Okay, so look, what Zizek is saying is, and he's tracing it back, he's giving Heidegger credit for this. Because Heidegger has this whole thing that's what's going to save us from becoming part of the technological machine and simply acting as its reserve army, which we're going to read when we read his stuff on technology, and I think that's next week, but I'll check. What we've lost is this ability to engage in critical thinking, which is slow reflection. Mm-hmm. And then Zizek then moves. Zizek writes in an interesting way, because instead of fleshing that out, he then moves to his joke about, like, Lenin's asked, who, like, I don't know. I think the thing is, like, what does he tell his
Wife or his mistress?
Yeah, but so again, there's a real violence. It's assuming that, it's the joke about, he tells them both, he tells his wife he's going to be with his mistress he's going to be with his wife, okay? And he goes to the library to read, learn. Which is an interesting way that Zizek flips it. He could have got there without sort of these sexist assumptions of like,
Well, Nietzsche would agree with that. He gets the solitude he needs to be an overman.
yeah, for critical reflection. Well, Heidegger was very much influenced by Nietzsche. But the critical reflection that Zizek's going for is he's saying, look, we go too fast to notice the objective violence. We go too fast to notice the violence that's embedded in the symbolic realm, so we don't have any reflection on it. We just take it as given. That's where he's going with it.
Isn't he
Jordan.
kind of denying what he's positing?
Are you getting tricky on me, or
But
is this a
denying
general
what he,
question?
no,
Is it-
denying what he's asserting, you're saying that we don't reflect and take time to reflect well.
He does.
Oh, he does.
Oh, yeah.
Whose behalf is he speaking on? Just like, this is what I mean by a structural functionalist idea, is you're not really giving any room for the human agency for somebody to say, to have actually had reflect and have an impact on society socially.
Well, no, I'm not being fair to Zizek there.
Yeah.
He does, and he's encouraging other people to do it. He doesn't see it as a tool that only a philosopher can do.
Yeah.
Okay, so I do mean to be fair for him, but yes. So he says there are situations when and this is where he goes with this. He got into trouble with this claim on page 7, and then I'll go to you in. He says there are situations when the only truly practical thing to do is to resist the temptation to engage immediately and to wait and see by means of a patient critical analysis. Now, it's not like he does that in his work. Okay? But sometimes what you say that is important to do, you're unable to do it yourself. But he's saying rather than jump in, we need to be able to step back and wait and see. That is, Zizek's saying we need to be able to engage in critical analysis. However, you can't engage in critical analysis until you actually learn, and that's where he goes to the Lenin quote. Now, the Lenin quote, and I've posed this to Zizek, and so the Lenin quote would work really well if he said, if he'd used, well, maybe it would work better, but he could have messed, it's like 2017, he could have messed around with the quote of it. He could have messed around with the quote of, Lenin's wife and her love, like he could have messed around with it, so it's not the standard generic sexist quote. Okay, and the standard generic sexist quote has embedded in it a violence. And so, and so in a sense, the trick for Zizek, he's trying to get people to critically reflect and analyze and not immediately move into subjective violence. Meanwhile, producing symbolic violence in the words of his text. And exposing, and I think it's interesting, I hadn't thought about this before, exposing objective violence we don't normally see and producing his own symbolic violence. Yeah?
I was just going to say, but the capacity for violence is pretty much innate. I mean, long before we had language, we were violent.
Okay.
I mean, I think,
Is
so
that
language
what you-
can trigger violence, but it exists as a potential in all of us at every moment.
Sure, as an effect and a physiological response. And that would probably manifest more in subjective violence, because you can see that happening.
Yeah,
So
and
like if I don't have language, but I throw a major
road rage,
attack.
say, road rage, which is unthinking violence,
No, road rage.
which, you know,
Well, hold on, that doesn't
Well, I
work.
don't think you'd be on the road if you didn't speak a language.
No, that doesn't work. You know why? It's got a name.
okay, so,
Okay, it's already been codified as road rage. It's already hit the symbolic. And at some level, it's acceptable to engage in road rage.
is it?
Well, I don't know. I don't do it because it's pretty hard to get really road raged in a Jeep, Like, you can't go that fast anyway, so whatever. But it's part of the symbolic acceptance of violence where, people are running people off the road. The thing that's weird in Toronto is people will come so close to you from behind that when you're changing lanes you can't, but they don't come close enough to really block you, so then everybody gets mad. But I don't know. Once it's named road rage, it's in the symbolic. But the emotion that develops there is that emotion you can go back to before you've had language, and that would be, like this just rage because somebody has gotten in your way and slowed you down, or they're, or they're an idiot watching, right? Owen and then Peter.
I was gonna say it's interesting. Because Jordan and I were talking about this yesterday. I started reading the book The Analects of Confucius, and the original translation was by a Catholic missionary.
Okay.
And they said that an entire culture is built off Confucianism, and yet in the Western world, everyone thought it was just a giant joke and it was a complete waste of time. But it's because the original translation in, say, like 1750 was done by this Catholic missionary who chose to use words in his translation that really didn't fit, that were actually just kind of literally crushing it through its words. And
That's
so
interesting.
today nobody really reads it, but yet, we read things like Plato and everything like that. I mean, Plato or Aristotle have all built giant cultures, and so has Confucius, but yet,
Yes.
because of translation, it was
And
lost.
if you want to read the East and West texts that occurred and play off against each other, take a course with Jay Golding.
Who?
Jay Golding. He teaches them. He actually teaches, Eastern and Western ancient texts to a first-year social science course that is basically geared towards business students. So they're all reading. It's pretty amazing, actually. And they can get a lot out of it, actually. Okay, so we got this false sense of urgency. And his first reflection then, he calls it SOS violence. What he's setting out here is the objective violence that's systemic in the regime. It's inherent in the regime. It's the subtle form of conversion that you don't, coercion that you don't see. It's going to sustain relations of domination and exploitation. I'm sure I've got footage of stuff I shot at the World Social Forum, so I'll see if I've got that for next week. So Zizek contends that the global elite and the counter-elite of anti-globalization movement. Now, the anti-globalization movement is an amazing movement where people come from all over the world and hold a protest. Now, you've got to get where people come. Peter, I forgot your question.
That was fine.
It's okay, I'll stop. I can look this up.
I was just going to say that I agree with Ian that violence, objective violence, doesn't really need language to exist. Like, I have a personal anecdote where I was at Walmart one time, and for no reason at all, this guy thought that I was looking at him funny and came up and tried to fight me. I laughed at him because I really didn't understand it, but there's like an underlying nonverbal violence or perception of violent intent between people.
It's just there in the objective that you don't see
just
until it
naming
explodes.
Pretty much.
And you probably looked at him some way that reminded him, or he thought you looked at him some way that reminded him of some time in the past when he'd been looked at that way, and he went, oh.
Or something.
Or, that's weird. Yeah, Stephen.
Yes, I'd say like that language isn't even objective violence, really, because that would be like
No, it's
body
symbolic.
language.
It's symbolic.
Right, yeah, because it's the connotations that you have with the look or with the words, right? It's not the words themselves that are offending you or the look. You know, it's what you think about it.
That's
the
good.
feeling that's in your mind is like not tangible.
That's good. Yasmin.
So
I'm observing him.
Are thoughts like built on language? Like even if it has
Well, that's what I would say.
meaning for everyone, like our schemata and the way we think and conceptualize anything, it has to be linked to words. Like even if it
And images. And images are also part of discourse for Lacan, which can also be part of language. So yeah, that works. That would be, but your point's well taken, Peter, because it's an objective form of violence that's just like there, that this other person is picked up on, that's going to manifest itself subjectively when something symbolic, like either the way you look or how he'd been looked at before, somebody who looked like you had beat him up before, or who knows what's going on in anybody else's head, because it's hard enough to tell what's going on in your own. But that set him off, and then it became subjective violence. So I think you're right, Yasmin. It's a play of both objective and symbolic. Yeah. Hold on. Stephen, did you have anything else or no?
I don't know. I was just gonna. It says that like our thoughts are built on language.
Well, our
But
thoughts are built on.
Are supported by language and fleshed out by language, but they're not built on it.
Well, try and have a thought, okay?
If I ran up and punched you in the face,
I don't mean that.
response,
I didn't mean that badly. I mean,
you're not
like,
gonna think about it.
no, but come on. When you're going to think about something, you have a thought. Your thoughts usually are either there in images or in language, which for Lacan, both of those are discourse.
But they're developed out of emotion.
No,
They're
entirely.
developed out of like a sense of what's happening around you or to you.
Your thoughts.
Yeah, your thoughts, and that's what will get you to think about something, and then you flesh them out with language.
Well, that's one of the components, but you either, in order to have a thought, I would say, you either have an image or, if you have different leads, it could be an image, a sound, a feeling, but it's something that's then going to trigger a thought. So I think if you combine what we both said together, it might work. But I don't think, and perhaps neither separately, because I don't think you can have a thought you can't, I don't think, if you look at what is called thinking, I don't think you can have a thought where you haven't, because they're really formed in language, which was kind of what Yasmin was saying, is like, what you're thinking is formed, is a social construction in a way, right?
Like a sophisticated thought. A sophisticated thought is built by language, but you can have a thought that's built on like, raw physical input,
Like run?
Like run
That's
or
a symbol.
pain or anger that
Well, or
happens.
your biases, like your biases that
Like
you don't
kind of
even
like a
think
road
about.
rage thing, right?
Yeah.
More
That's,
extreme.
but
If
I would
something
maintain
happens-
that comes out of the symbolic, the road rage, and it goes into subjective. But okay, I did it. Yasmin, you had something, and now, if I've got the wrong time, it's about 10:02, right?
12:47.
Okay, so look, I want to do a little bit more on Zizek, and I want to do at least 10 minutes on Nietzsche. So Yasmin, because Zizek we can pick up next week because we're also doing Zizek next week, so that's not a problem. We've got the basics there. Yasmin, what were you going to say?
But even when you're talking about what you call like raw instinct, it's still a symbol that would like invoke that reaction. And I think like symbols are language. Like if it's an image or like if you have the instinct to run, but it's because you see a gun, it's because you have associations
Right.
with a gun.
Yeah, that makes, I mean, I would probably, I'm a big Zizek fan in terms of being formed in language, so I would like stick there. I want to do one more thing on Zizek, and then I'll shift over, and I'll do the rest of Zizek next week with the rest of Zizek. And then we'll shift over to Nietzsche, because we don't want to miss some of the Nietzsche, because in this, no. Most important two sections in Nietzsche are in today's reading. Okay, so he's talking about the global elite, and he says that the counter-elite, because in order to get to world social forums, you have to travel there, you usually have to fly there. So although you're a protester, such as I was, and I was filming it, you still are elite in that you can actually get there. And he says they've evened out in terms of ideology. Both sides are post-political. Then he goes to, Bill Gates, George Soros, CEOs of Google and IBM. They're not that different for somebody like Hart and Negri, because both sides of this see a potential in digital capital. So he's saying we've almost hit a point, and that's why Ian's examples were interesting. We've hit a point where both sides of the political are post-political until Trump comes in. I would say he's going to say something different here. Partly because the new capitalism that's post-political has a lot of the features of communism. So Gates is an ex-hacker. You've got a counter-cultural corporate elite who don't really separate market expansion from social responsibility. And what I want to draw your attention to is page 18. It's the 10 Commandments of liberal capitalism. And these 10 Commandments of liberal capitalism are post-political commandments. And I'll just run through them very quickly on page 18. Give everything away for free. Free access, no copyright. You charge for the additional services, which is going to make you richer. Change the world, don't sell things. Don't just sell things. Be caring, sharing, and aware of social responsibility. Be creative, focus on design, new technologies. 5, tell it all, there should be no secrets. Have the cult of transparency, free flow of information. All humanity should collaborate. Don't work and take on a fixed 9-to-5 job. Just engage in improvised, smart, dynamic, flexible communication. Go back to school, engage in permanent education, which is also awesome. There's a problem with all of these, which I'm sure you're thinking. Act as an enzyme, work not only for the market, but trigger new forms of social collaborations. Die poor. Return your wealth to those who need it, since you have more than you can ever spend. And stand in for the state. Practice the partnership of companies with the state. So he's saying these are post-political principles that the corporate elite act according to, that overlap with socialist principles. And he's linking then both global elites and anti-global counter-elites, because both sides are about changing the world to a better place. They just have different ways of doing it. He also points out, as we know, that the global hides the complicity of neo-imperialism. And I'll stop with the revisiting of Nietzsche's Last Man. So if you've stop there and go to Nietzsche. If you go to page 28, he revisits Nietzsche's last man that is in all of us, and he says it's a passive nihilism. It's a passive nihilism that fits very well with objective violence and the symbolic. Whereas active nihilism, that's an attempt to make a change, is the subjective violence, the visible violence, the subjective violence of those that are willing to sacrifice for a cause. And I'm going to shift then to Nietzsche, because I want to take you through, and I'll pick up there. I should mark off where I ended, because I'll pick up there. So today's what, March 1? If you take a look, Nietzsche is on his way back up to the mountain. And the first, I want to take you to some quotes from Nietzsche, starting around page 130. I want to take you through ones that are sort of really important. What you find happening on 130 is Nietzsche's on his way back. He's going to meet some more people, but he's on his way back up to the mountain to think some more. And we've got this quote again that keeps recurring. It's a quote where he says, it's time, it's high time. And then he's talking with this shape that comes to him. And the shape tells him about the earth. So at the bottom of page 130, he says the earth has a skin, and this skin has diseases. One of these diseases, for example, is called man. And then if you go to page 131, so I'm just going to point you to passages. If you go to page 131, Nietzsche says, he makes a distinction between great events and the stillest hours. And he says our greatest events are not our loudest, but our stillest hours. Not around the inventors of new noise, but around the inventors of new values does the world revolve. It revolves inaudibly. So that kind of fits in with the objective violence. It's inaudible. But that's not what Nietzsche's talking about there. He's talking about the ability to reflect. 133, the ghost cries, and Zarathustra says, the ghost, why did the ghost cry? It's time, it's high time. High time for what? And the high time is, you could do a lot with the high time. So then Zarathustra's got the keys to open the most creaking gates. And I want to take you to page 139. The two most important passages here for Nietzsche studies is resentiment, or resentment, and eternal recurrence. And he sets these out sort of very well in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So on page 139, well, first he defines, 139 is also important because he defines what Zarathustra is. At the top he says, what is Zarathustra? A seer, a willer, a creator, a future himself, and a bridge to the future. All this is Zarathustra. And then he talks about being a redeemer of accidents. Now, if you've got a will, if you go down to the middle of page 131, or 139, if you've got a will that says it was to redeem those who lived in the past and to recreate it was, to recreate all it was into a thus I willed it. So if you're in resentment, you can't say thus I willed it. Rather, you're stuck in passive nihilism. You're stuck in the it was. So what makes this distinction for Nietzsche is turning it was, hi, turning, go ahead, it's okay. Okay, you're behind. Turning it was into I willed it. And if you go to page 140, if you're stuck in it was, he says, this is the will's ill will against time, and it was. If you flip that to I willed it, it keeps you out of resentment. The resentment is, thus the will, the liberator to hurting, and in all who can suffer he wreaks revenge for his inability to go backwards. It's the lament that you can't go backwards, it's the lament that you can't go back to it was. That is ressentiment. Thus indeed, this alone is what revenge is, the will's ill will against time, and it was. He's going to mention the stillest hour again on page 145. He says, yesterday, it's the first paragraph towards the bottom, and it's in the section called the stillest hour, bottom of the first paragraph. Yesterday, toward evening, there spoke to me my stillest hour. And then, of course, for him, his stillest hour is his awesome mistress. The stillest hour is that moment where you reflect, which then Nietzsche kind of spoils by making it his awesome mistress. But the stillest hour is what speaks to you, to go back to what Stephen is saying in a sense, without voice. It's thought without voice. It's on page 146, the stillest words. It's your thought process that tells you to do something. He says there, it spoke to me again without without voice. And the words that it brought to him are things like, you have forgotten how to walk. You've forgotten the way, and now you've also forgotten how to walk. He then observes that it's the stillest words that bring on the storm. It's from the stillest words and the stillest thoughts that's going to make you want to make changes. And in order to do this, his stillest voice said to him again. So his stillest voice is that voice you hear in your head that's not speaking. And his voice tells him, you must become a child again without shame. The pride of youth is still upon you. You become young late. But whoever would become a child must overcome his youth too. It takes you to the third part. So he's still walking, he's going back, he's a wanderer, and he's climbing back up the mountain when you hit the section on the wanderer in 152. Second paragraph there. Now, as Zarathustra was climbing the mountain, he thought how often since his youth he'd wandered alone, and how many mountains and ridges and peaks he'd already climbed. It's a return. The whole book has been read as a manifestation of Nietzsche's eternal return. A manifestation of returning again, going back up to the mountain, coming back down to the valley, going back up to the cave, coming back down to the people. He says on 152, what returns, what finally comes home to me is my own self. And his own self had been in strange lands and scattered among many things and accidents. But he has to keep going. And I'm going to take you now to where he talks about, I think, one of the best discussions of eternal return. Before I do that, he's going to make a reference there to what he calls dwarf, which is a part human, part mole. Let me just say, we can recognize that as objectionable. And we could talk about that, but let me take you through this. We can maybe talk about that because he's talking about the gateway. And what he's talking about there is this eternal return of a moment. Okay? He's saying to the spider that we've been here before, you and I, in this same moment, and it's happening again. We've been here speaking of eternal things. Have we not been here before? So the gateway in the moment is very important there. he says, now I'm going to read you, you've got the translation of 157 to 158. I'm going to read you the more poetic one for this particular passage. But this one actually has more, the one you've got has more substance in a way. I'll read maybe both of them. Behold this gateway, two paths meet here. No one has yet followed either to its end. The long lane stretches back for an eternity. And that long lane out there, that is another eternity. The name of the gateway, as you come to this gateway, is inscribed above it, moment. Behold this moment. From this gateway, moment, a long eternal lane leads backwards. Behind us lies an eternity. And this is where you get the eternal return. And this slow spider and this moonlight, and I and you in the gateway, whispering together, whispering of eternal things. Must not all of us have been here before, and return and walk in the other lane, in this long, dreadful lane? Must we not eternally return? What Deleuze does with this is really important, I think. And that is that this eternal return, Deleuze adds something to it. It's repetition, but it's always slightly different. So it's eternal return. So his book, Repetition and Difference, is kind of about that, right? It's this eternal return. We return again and again, and we've been there before and before, but it's always slightly different. So it's eternal return with a difference. Then what you get, and I'll end with this, he comes across a shepherd, and the shepherd has been sleeping and a snake is crawled in his throat. You're like, yeah, that's pretty violent language. And Zarathustra is trying to pull the snake out, and that can't happen. So he says to the shepherd, bite it off. He says, the shepherd bit as my cry counseled him. He spewed the head of the snake, and he jumped up. No longer shepherd, no longer human, one changed, radiant, laughing. And he says, never had he heard laughter that strong. That laughter kind of plays into one of the key moments you get in Zarathustra of where change happens. Change and chance happens. And I'll take you to page 166, which was the last page to read for today. He returns again to chance. He says, by chance, that is the most ancient nobility of the world. And this I restore to all things. I delivered from their bondage under purpose. So he's juxtaposing their chance and purpose. And part of the chance equation, when Zarathustra is talking about it, you can say that eternal return takes place under chance. What also occurs with chance is laughter. And the real question you would come back to is, I think, what he means by it's time, it's high time. He's going to end with that too. He's going to return to that, and end to that. And I mean, you have different takes on it. I mean, simply he could mean it's high time for the overman to come into being. But you find that Zarathustra says it when he's about to make changes, when something sort of dramatic is about to happen. So let's take a break. How many people are presenting today? I think there's 4, but I'm not sure. Are you presenting? You hurt your hand.
Yeah.
No, that's bad. Can I see hands of people? Who else is presenting? You're presenting? Anybody else? Only 2? Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break. I think there's somebody else, but they maybe have not got here or they're not coming. Take a 15-minute break. So she'll be back at 1:20. It's 5 after, and we'll do the tutorial. Meanwhile, I'm going to check out who's presenting. Oh, and I can turn on the tape. Sorry, are you presenting today or not?
I'm actually not sure.